morning, this is Susan Westbrook. It's an early Sunday morning if you're in Central or Mountain or Pacific time. So I appreciate you joining me for the third in my series of 5 sessions and live posts here on Facebook about not getting lost in your loss. Now today I have put on my Sherlock Holmes garb because we're off to a new question today. Yesterday, our organizing question for survival was WTF, and yes, it means exactly that, but no, I'm not saying that out loud, even on Facebook. Today, the question that we're going to be looking at is what's changed as we move into talking about recovery. And that's a big subject. It's actually a big part of the loss process and the grief continuum. So thanks for joining us for that. I am going to take off my hat because otherwise, by the end of the day, I'm going to have serious hat head. So I'm not going to wear that, but it was cool to have. I earned that at a Mystery Theater when I first came back to Claremore. I won that for some insane piece that I added to some Mystery Theater that my friend Linda keeps popping up in these posts, so I hope she's watching. So that's what we're doing today. So let's do a little bit of review of what we talked about yesterday, and then we're going to launch in this morning talking about recovery. Hope you have a cup of coffee or something to sort of, put you in a relaxed state while we're going through this process and looking at actually where the healing starts in the grief cycle and the loss timeline. So yesterday we spent quite a bit of time yesterday morning talking about grief and about the grief cycle. And you'll just remember that we have some event that happens. It takes us down into kind of the shock or immobilized phase. We go up through denial, come up in that cycle to anger. We've got a little bit more energy. We can get a little bit pissed off. Not a bad thing, actually, when you're going through grief. And then we'll go back down into depression and then up into acceptance. And I shared with you yesterday that actually being in depression was an eye-opener for me, because I knew when I got to depression that I was about out of the grief cycle. So if you're at that place and you're kind of got the down and nothing's quite right and you can't feel you're happy, I would say, woohoo, and let's go forward with the grief process there and move on out into acceptance. So depression's not necessarily a bad thing. The part of the timeline that was about survival, which we talked about yesterday, is that beginning piece from the shock and awe and, I can't even move my body. And I even gave you the example of being 5 years old and cutting my leg really badly and not being able to feel that. It's that's kind of that process of survival. And remember from yesterday that we're in dino brain mode. We're really reactive. We're self-protective. Our emotions are all over the place. And if we had our mascot T-Rex, just in case you forget what it's like to be in the survival phase. The survival phase is a really important piece for you because because everything has changed, it's where you get a chance to actually get your feet. And I know that feels really strange to say when you're in the very beginning of the grief cycle and you're feeling all of those emotions and all of that sadness and it feels like the world is never going to be the same again. But the survival phase is really important. It's one of the reasons I talked to you yesterday a little bit about what you need during the survival phase. This is not a working phase. This is not a coach's work here. This is you getting the support you need and the compassion that you need. And we talked about it being a no judgment zone, a no comparison zone, and a no fix-it zone. We talked about needing safety and privacy, so that you can actually, when you have those feelings, that you can move those through the body and you can move those through the system so that you can put your feet down at some point and say, okay, I'm ready for the next step. So don't feel like survival phase is something that you don't want to go through. In fact, each of the phases of this process are very important. Grief itself, as we talked about yesterday, is normal and it's natural and it's very necessary. And people who try to not go through the grief cycle when they have encountered a loss are people that we see years later still having those lives. Oh, what did I do with them? I probably moved them. I got my angel card this morning. Remember those lives that are always stuck because they can't get out of the grief. They didn't process the grief in the appropriate time. And that's just a reminder that grief has an arc. It has a time span. There's a natural flow to this stuff, So if you get stuck or cycle back and keep putting yourself back in the process, that's something to look at, and something when you could call a coach. And also that it is quite sticky. And then if we don't deal with it in its appropriate time, it's going to keep messing up the work. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more today when we get that plunger out finally and talk about that. All right, put those props up. And it was interesting to me today, I'll just share with you. Those of you who know me well know I draw my angel cards every day. And I actually have my angel candle, and I never can tell what you can see on the screen and what you can't, because it seems like you can see different things than I can. But the angel card today was celebration. And I always think it's interesting when I draw an angel card for perspective in the morning, and it seems to have nothing to do with what I'm about to talk about. For instance, I'm about to talk about the work of recovery, which is damn hard work actually, but let's talk about celebration, right? So what is the celebration in recovery? For one thing, I just want to say part of the celebration in recovery is probably you can feel your life again, that you are conscious being again, and that you are not living your life in dino brain. So that in of itself is probably a pretty good celebration to have. So if you're in that place where you're about to move into recovery, remember your word for the day is celebration. See if you can find some in there. Okay, we reviewed, I'm looking at my notes. We reviewed what we've talked about so far. We've reviewed what it looks like to be in survival. And now I want to just move into speaking to you a little bit about the recovery process. This is a complicated process, so I'm not going to probably add a lot to your knowledge here, maybe just a little bit of perspective shift about what recovery is and how you can go about it and why it's so important in your life. So the first thing I want to do is just define recovery. You know, survival means that you're just remaining alive, right? That's the whole goal of, and you think about it, you know, think about our guys, what's their goal? Just going to survive. You got to keep the species going. And that's pretty much where you are in survival. But in recovery phase, there's a sense that we're going to return to normal. And we're going to talk about that in a second. Or that we're going to regain control of something that we've lost control of. Now, when I read those definitions, I was thinking, okay, so I've had a major loss and everything in my life has changed. How is it that I'm ever going to be returning to normal? Well, I think the answer to that is you're not. Not that normal anyway. Not the normal that you were used to. But you are going to return to your life. You're going to return to being more conscious, more aware, more in charge of your emotions. And actually you will be regaining some control as you go through the recovery process. Because remember, that survival phase, that's reactive and unpredictable and unbalanced. And so actually, as we move into recovery, we are going to be feeling a little bit more in control of ourselves. Now, are we going to be able to go back and have control of the life that has been shattered or changed significantly by the loss that we've encountered? Well, probably not. And so that's not really the goal of recovery, is it? We're not going to be trying to get our life back. And I'm going to tell you a story in a minute about a man who could not let his loss go and had a big impact on his life. But as I was thinking about the definition of recovery, I sort of think in prepositions, I guess. So I came up with, what are we recovering from? What are we recovering to? And what are we recovering for? And so I just want to add that to our definition and our thoughts about recovery. First of all, obviously, we're recovering from the loss that we encountered and all the changes that we encountered. But we're also recovering from the separation that we felt during survival. You know, during the survival phase, when we're very self-protective, we need our privacy, we need our safety, we need to find a way to get our feet down. Well, we have separated from folks in our own way, emotionally, physically. Maybe we've even separated from God. You know, the first person who often has to take the brunt of our anger and our sadness is God. And recovery phase is a chance to recover back to your relationship with God or your higher power, however you think of that, with the people in your life, and to recover from that loss and that change. That is actually part of what we're trying to do. We also want to recover too. And remember that our goal in this whole process is living happily ever after. So we want to return to a life that is full and vibrant and actually extraordinary. And very often, even more extraordinary than the life that you had when you thought you had everything before the loss. So we actually want to be able to recover to that new sense of ourselves and of our life. And then we also want to recover for the sake of, for the purpose of the soar. Now I talk a lot about the soar, about the flight. You know, we are not meant to be earthbound creatures in our spirits. I do not believe that. I think we look around in nature around us and we see that soaring is the goal. And we want to soar too. And we don't want to have second best lives. And that's why we go through the recovery process. That's why we allow ourselves the work of recovery, is because we know there's a what's next on the other side. There's a reformation phase on the other side where we're going to actually be able to create lives that are maybe more stupendous than we ever imagined possible. And that's another reason that we are going to go through the work of recovery. Now, one thing I want to say about recovery is that it is the healing phase. It's the, thank you for that thumbs up, whoever gave me that. The healing is that recovery is the healing phase of our lost timeline. It is the place when we are in the midst of healing. When we get over into the next phase in reformation, we are transcending life, we are transforming life, but in this case, we are healing. So in survival, we're surviving, right? We're just trying to get through the day and remain alive in the midst of what's happened to us. But now over here in recovery, we're going to just be sitting back and taking some time to heal. Now, I'd like to tell you, and I'd like to be able to tell you, that the work of recovery is sit back in the chair and meditate a little bit and have a peaceful time. But actually, recovery is just hard work. It is hard work from the first to the end. Because as we've seen our characters in fairy tales, character transformation actually takes a lot of presence and a lot of attention. And I want to go through some phases of that work with you today, just briefly. We're not going to go in any depth and detail with those. But before I do that, I want to tell you a little story. I was talking, my friend Diane said, you do a good mix of story and the coaching piece. And I'm like, good, because if you've read my book, 5 Tibetan Jug Workshop, you know that I love to tell stories, and I love for those stories to create metaphors for my readers so that they can see those metaphors in their own life. And I want to offer these 2 stories to you today so that you can understand why we go through this process of recovery, even though it is pretty hard work and we're pretty heartbroken when we start the process. So, you know my story that, you know, somewhere in the 1st of May last year, I'm in a 9th floor laundry room in a hotel, and I get the call on the Skype that says basically that our relationship is over. From there, I processed through to finishing my trip with my sister Lisa, going up to see my dad in Portland, coming over to Oklahoma to my sister Julie's graduation, and then ultimately make my way over to Charlotte, where Robert and Laura had offered me an opportunity to stay in their guest room for a while, which I think they call Susan's room. I think they do. And sometimes I think they call it Bill's room, because I think Bill stays there a lot too. And I want to give a shout out to Rob, who's Laura's brother, and just thanks for messaging yesterday, and thanks for taking the time to watch and actually give me some feedback. So just want to make sure I caught up with you on that. But somewhere around July, after I've been at Robert and Laura's and gone up and down the highway to Jenny, my daughter's in Kernersville, I started to get a voice. Now, some of you know me, know I call them downloads or guidance or whatever. But the word Manteo and the concept of going to Manteo, North Carolina really started to get big in my space. And I love Manteo. It's a little town on Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina. I've taken students there. It's a historic site, and we're going to talk about that in a second. And I wondered if, okay, well, I've always loved Manteo, so maybe the reason I'm going there is because I need, it's going to be where I'm going to live next. So I looked up maybe jobs in Manteo, maybe apartments there, whatever, because at this point I have no idea what's happening to me or where I'm going next or what I'm going to do. But I followed my guidance, and I went up to Kernersville, and I was packing up for this trip to Manteo, and I was in the middle of packing, and all of a sudden it occurred to me what Manteo is about. Now, if you know anything about American history with regard to that part of the country, you know that Roanoke Island is the site of what is called the Lost Colony. Lost Colony is probably one of the biggest mystery stories in early exploration history. A guy named John White brought a ship of people over to colonize. Actually wanted to go up to Jamestown, but because of the storms up and down the coast, they got knocked off a course, and they ended up at Roanoke Island in this place, and they started a colony there. And he had his wife and his daughter, and actually Virginia Dare, who was his granddaughter, was the first English settler to be born in what was then that part of the New World. Well, at some point, John White has to go on his ship and go back to England because they need supplies. Well, lo and behold, as he does that, he meets the Spanish Armada, which means that when he gets back to England, the Queen's not about to let any ships go out because she needs all the ship power she can get. So it's 3 years before he can travel back to the colony. So he actually comes back to the colony 3 years to the day of his granddaughter's birth and gets out there on that island off the coast of North Carolina, and there is no sign of the colony. Not only is there just no sign of the folk, there's no sign of them ever having been there except for the words Croatan written on a tree. Well, John White makes it his life pursuit to figure out what's happened to his family and his friends. And I can understand that. You know, the people that signed up with him to get on the ship, the people that came from England and their lives there over to the New World, he felt responsible, and I certainly appreciate that. But he actually gave up his life. He gave up all of his life in pursuit of trying to figure out and get back this thing that he lost. And I think as the story recounts, he ended up being a house guest of Sir Walter Raleigh and pretty much living his life out in despair. That is a pretty sad story, but a great example of what it looks like when you can't process your loss and move forward, isn't it? That is the epitome of staying in the grief cycle and not making your way out. Well, what occurred to me about the time I got the download about, oh, this is what Mania is about, there's a very cool story that's associated with this part of the world. So if you stand there on Roanoke Island, where they landed in the ship, and you look across the sound at that little bitty expansive waterway, and those of you who are from North Carolina or know what I'm talking about, there's the Outer Banks right out there, right? There's a big old sandbar is basically what it is. And guess what's over there? I know you're already saying this. Kitty Hawk. Kitty Hawk, North Carolina is over there. And what do you know about Kitty Hawk, North Carolina? Well, on December 17th, 1903, the Wright brothers had the first manned flights at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So when you think about when I talk about my book title being Dreams Lost and Wings Found, you can think of me standing there on the beach, on Manteo, right off of Manteo, right at Lost Colony, and looking across from the place of the big dream lost to the amazing wings found on the other side. And that's what we're after, right? Because if we stay in our loss, we become like John White. You know, we go back and we ruminate about it and feel responsible. And you know, we're going to talk about taking responsibility in a minute as part of our work. But we lose our life in the process. This guy was amazing. On their first travels over, which happened some years before, he was the one who created all of the pictures of the wildlife that they were involved in and what the colonies looked like. And his artwork has gone forward through the ages as a picture of what was happening on that island when it was first colonized, when they first went over just to explore it. And here he is, a great leader. He was a governor, and and nothing, right? He let it all go because he couldn't let go of the loss. And when I talk about getting lost in the loss, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You know, we've got to move past the responsibility that we feel, or the guilt, or the blame, or whatever it is we're giving ourselves, and move into that next phase. So I want to talk just a second about Kitty Hawk, because I want to inspire you a little bit about what's possible, right? So after I've done my work over at Manteo, and I've gone and done some research on that, and I did some videos on that, I went across to Kitty Hawk. It was about 96 or 97 degrees. I might try to post that video for you, because like I am profusely sweating in the heat that day, and out in the middle of a field, because that's where they picked it, right? They picked Kitty Hawk because of the amazing winds that they had there, and also because it was a desolate seaside place at the time. Now it's all touristed up, but you know, that's how life goes. But in that day, on December 17th, they made 4 flights, 4 successive flights. The first one, not more than 30 feet. The last one, 800 and something feet. I think 812, if I'm correct. So I took that walk as a part of my own healing and a part of reminding myself of why I was in the process of healing. I took that walk along with all the parents screaming at their children because it was really hot, and all the kids screaming and crying. I knew everybody there was there for a different reason, but I was so aware I was there for the sacred moment of taking the walk with the Wright brothers on that day, when finally, after years of work and trying and putting all their efforts together, they were able to take those hops on that airplane all the way down to 800 feet. Now, one of the coolest parts of that story is that they crashed their plane the day before. They crashed the plane. They were all ready to go, and actually their first flight was going to be on December 16th, but it didn't turn out being that way. And if you hear a train whistle, I'm in Claremore, Oklahoma. I think they have like 150 trains go through here a day. Not exactly, but almost. So they had crashed the plane the day before. They had to regroup and start over. And that happens to us, doesn't it? In our recovery process, in our building toward the future, we are going to come into times when we're going to crash and burn, and we're going to rebuild, and we're going to go on. And that's a great little short snippet of a story that actually says a lot about what the work of recovery is for. So if you don't take anything else out of these videos, I want you just to have that moment of thinking about being John White, getting off that little boat onto that island and finding the colony gone, and having a choice at that point about how he's going to move forward. Is he going to continue to lament the loss of his family and his friends? Obviously, he wants to honor that. Obviously. At the same time, give his life up for it. Because who knows what else would have been possible for him? Who knows what his real mission was, what his divine purpose was? But we're never going to know that because he stopped. Because he had had a failure, I think, as he saw it, and he had lost his family and his friends. And then just to stand in that place and look across that water, that little strip of water, to what was possible on the other side. The dream lost over here, the wings found over there. Those guys in that little flying machine changed history, right? And if they had, after the loss of the day before, decided that they weren't going to do it, think about what we had been losing. Now, somebody would have ultimately done it, I'm pretty sure. But at the same time, it's a great story, and it's a great picture of how close we are when we have lost the thing that's most important to us, to finding something that's going to take us into the next, whatever's next for us. And that waterway between the two, I want you to see this metaphor. I love teaching from the metaphor, so the waterway in between, that's recovery, right? From the dream lost to the wings found, that's the recovery phase. So let's talk a little bit more about the work of recovery, because it is work. And as a coach, this is where I come in. This is where I start to really get my feet down with my clients, because this is a change process. It's a change on the inside of us, and it's a recognition of the change that has happened on the outside of us. I think the first piece of the work that we do in recovery is that we actually have to come to accepting where we are now. Now, if you think about the grief timeline, the cycle there, you know that at some point after depression, you're moving up into acceptance. And we have to do the work of acceptance. Things are not going to change back to the way they were. Things are never going to be the same again. You know, we say that out loud to ourselves when things change, but it's actually true. Things are never going to be the same again, and we're never going to be the same again, right? So we have to come to a place of accepting that. The second piece of work I think we have to do is look around and have an assessment. You know, that's kind of where I brought Sherlock Holmes in today, right? Because we need to be looking around and doing a little investigating about what is now true in our life. And assessment is good. Like, what are my financial situation? What's my housing? What are my relationships? What are my community? What has changed? What's the same for me? If you're like me, wow, lots changed, right? Pretty much everything. Down to the country I was living in, the language that was being spoken around me, the way I was identifying. There isn't one thing really that didn't change about me other than my immediate friends and family. So we have to assess, maybe think of it as the damage, but I'd like to assess the assets, like what's left that I'm going to keep, and how am I going to move forward with that. The third thing that we have to do, now I'm going to get personal, right? So after we have accepted where we are and we've looked around to see what it is that we've still got or maybe we lost, the third thing we've got to do is start the work of forgiveness. Now, if you've been in 12-step programs or other recovery programs, you know forgiveness of self and other is a big part of the work. And one of the things that we get hung up with in the grief continuum And in the lost timeline is that we can move to resentment pretty easily, especially if someone did something not very nice to us. And I'm going to say that a lot of us even do this to God, right? Like, he shouldn't have let this happen, or how could this happen? And we can't forgive God for whatever happened too. So I don't think this is just an earthly, plain sort of forgiveness pattern. Now, yesterday I brought in the bleach, and I brought this in for a reason. It's poison. I did tease that I was going to try to drink this today, but I really don't want to. That would be hazardous to my health. And that's exactly what a lack of forgiveness is. It's a hazard to our health. And we hear this all the time, that, resenting folks is like taking poison and expecting them to die. Or a favorite that I've now taken on, which came up in a post I made on email the other day, which is peeing down your leg and expecting someone else to get uncomfortable. I love that one because it actually has the picture of you're standing there with your pants wet and expecting someone else to feel uncomfortable. And very often, because we're unwilling to forgive ourselves or others or God, we are standing around with our pants wet all the time where everybody can see it, right? We're slipping back in, sticking in the recycling into anger. That resentment just keeps, because resentment means re-feeling, right? So we're just constantly being back in what we're feeling all the time. That'll make you sick, right? It's not going to help your life any, and it's actually not hurting the other person. So we've got to come to a place where we can get to forgiveness as part of the work of recovery. Once we're in the forgiveness mode, once I can forgive myself, forgive God, forgive the other people, the work of recovery is actually pretty easy. And I can get through the rest of that recovery process. I think the sticking point is right here. So, you might want to get, if you feel like there's some forgiveness that you need to be giving folks, you might just get out a bottle of something that's poison and just thinking about drinking that. Like, not really seriously, you know what I'm saying? Metaphorically. Drink that and think about what you're doing to yourself. Because this is a hazard to your health. And it's definitely a hazard to your forward movement. And I know you know that, so I'm not trying to lecture you, even though it might seem like I am. But I feel really strongly about this. Because I know in my own life, the places in my life where I've had the hardest time moving from place to place as I needed to, was when I wasn't willing to forgive myself or forgive the other person for what had happened. And in this situation that I've just been in, that forgiveness came somewhere after December, after the, I'm depressed piece. So right up there in the acceptance part, as we start to get into acceptance on the grief cycle, it's a really good time to think about how much poison you're drinking, hoping the other person is going to feel the pain, because I can guarantee you that other person is not feeling that pain. They might be feeling some pain, but they're not feeling your pain. That's your job. All right, so we've now used our bleach. The next thing I want to talk about is taking responsibility. Now, I'm a great story breakthrough coach, and the great story has a little process called the responsibility formula. Recognize, acknowledge, forgive, and change. Notice how forgiveness came up again. There are things that we need to take responsibility for. I don't care what the change is or what the loss was. There's something in there that we could recognize about ourselves, acknowledge the impact that it had on ourselves and others. We can forgive ourselves and others, and then we can bring the change about in our lives. Now, let's just think about John White for a second. Here's a guy that was racked with grief, blamed himself. Those are kind of secondary emotions, right? What he really needed to do was probably process his own grief and sadness and take responsibility for what he could do, not for what he couldn't do. He went off in good faith to get supplies to bring him back. He couldn't control anything that was happening. So having guilt about that's a false emotion. He can have remorse. He can have great sadness. But sometimes we get ourselves totally sucked into blame and guilt. Those things never move us forward. Or judgment, which is a way of just not at all dealing with our stuff, right? Judging ourselves or others. What we want to do is get into a place where we can take responsibility for our part. And in my case, what I had to take responsibility for, what I learned through working in the mastery program with Lucid Living last year, was taking responsibility for some of the ways I have of being in relationship. some wounding that I hadn't cleared up yet, some behavior patterns that were really not in my best interest, and coming face to face with myself. And that's often what is necessary when we're taking responsibility. You couldn't do anything to keep your child from dying or your partner from passing away. But doesn't mean that you can't go in and do some of the deeper inner work of taking responsibility for some pieces that may have made a difference in the situation, and so you're blaming yourself or you're feeling guilty. So look in, see if there's blame and guilt and judgment, especially about yourself, because you can start here first, can't really do anything out there. So look in and see, and then see if you need to recognize what it was, acknowledge the impact it had on yourself and others, forgive yourself and anyone else who's involved, and then you're open to change. And I think that's what the coolest part of that process is that there is no change without forgiveness. So that brings us back up into number 3, into the poison area again, right? And finally, I know you're going to love this one. Finally, the work of recovery is to clear old crap. So we'll bring out our plunger today. Now, I think it's interesting that every plunger I've seen in somebody's house has plastic wrap on it or something like this, right? And I did this because I tried to clean this thing out, and I won't even go into detail. But it was disgusting. But so why do we wrap these things up? Well, I think we wrap them up because we don't want the crap from one time being in the next thing that we do, right? We don't want to put our hands all over that, and we don't want it to get on the floor. When we hold on to old stuff, to old wounds, old resentments, old pieces of ourselves that we're not willing to process, we basically are walking around with an unwrapped plunger, right? With all the crap from before that's just going to keep getting on everything we do. Now, I like to use the toilet paper on your shoe metaphor here. You'd think, okay, so I used to be a high school teacher, and I have boys. All my grandchildren are boys. So yeah, I'm into bodily processes, and I can talk about poop and things like that pretty easily. But what I think is interesting about the toilet paper on the shoe piece, in fact, I was with a friend not too long ago, and we had just been talking about this, and we were in a restaurant, and a guy walks by us with a big piece of toilet paper on his shoe, and we both looked at each other and started cracking up. It's like, should we tell him? Because we had talked about that, like, do we tell people? It's like, he's walking around with toilet paper on his shoe, and the only person that knows he's not doing it is him. This is the part of not dealing with your crap, because everybody else knows you're not dealing with your crap except for you. And that's why you want, during the work of recovery, to be really focused on clearing the old stuff out of your life. Our goal for recovery is to set the foundation for the reformation phase, for the living happily ever after phase. And we can't do that if we can't plunge out the crap from the past. So I want to just, if you need to put your plunger out where you can see it regularly, then just to remember that if there's some stuff in there that you need to clear up, then be willing to do the work of that, because that is the hard work and the important work of the recovery process. And it's generally the last work that we do. Once we've come to a place where we can accept what's going on, we've done our assessment, we've looked around to see what we need to forgive ourselves and others for, we have taken on responsibility that's ours and processed ourselves through, then we're ready to clear our crap from the past so that we can open space for what's next, which is what's coming up in our reformation phase. Okay. So we're about to transition out of this, but I don't want to do it without talking about our Band-Aids. All right? Not a solution to recovery. Even though recovery is a healing process, we are not putting Band-Aids on stuff, right? We're not covering them up, and we're not pretending that they aren't as bad as they are. Because if we do that, then we're going to be sticking and cycling all the way through. So part of recovery is really addressing the truth of your wounds, the truth of the way that you might be wounding others, and then doing the work around that. Not putting Band-Aids on stuff. Not putting Band-Aids on like my 5-year-old knee that got cut totally open that I told you about yesterday. A Band-Aid is not going to fix that problem. And generally the Band-Aid solutions that we have in life, the things that we try to do so that we don't have to do the work of recovery, also not effective. But I wanted the Band-Aids to get their due today. How will you know? How will you know when you're done with recovery? You are not going to like this. You are not going to like this part. I'm even getting emotional telling you you're not going to like it because that's how much I didn't like it either. You know what this is? This is a thank you card. Yes, my eyes are tearing over. This is a thank you card. You'll know that you are done with the work of recovery or pretty far through the work of recovery because I think it's a continuous cycle. When you can say thank you for what happened to you. I was in February. I remember it. And that was the first time I uttered the word thank you. Glad I can see what this was about. Got into March. A little bit more thank you. Now into April. Almost May, a year later, I can say thank you. It's a long haul. I just remember the day that I wasn't sad anymore. I remember coming back from working and doing 5 Tibetans at the Tulsa Day Center residential center there and having just been in the beginning of the new relationship. And I was driving on the highway and I suddenly thought, I'm not sad. This was on my sister's birthday, so it was May the 10th. I'm not sad. March the 10th. I'm not sad. And I just started sobbing. Not because I was sad, but because I was like, I'm not sad. After all the months of crying in the morning, crying at night, waking up, crying in the middle of the night, crying on the sidewalk, crying at the table, crying to when anybody, I wasn't sad. It was the most remarkable moment of this whole process. I wasn't sad. And I think a lot of it is because I dedicated myself to the work of this grief cycle and to recovery. And I had such good support along the way with the teaching and the community that I had in the mastery program with the Great Story Breakthrough. And it's actually what I want to offer you in the program that's coming up, Creating Life After Loss, in May. I want to offer you that opportunity to be in the car at some point and break down crying because you recognize you're not sad anymore. You're not sad. And the breakthrough moment for that, I think, is coming to a place where you can say thank you. Thank you to God, maybe the first person. Thank you to the person that has done this to you or has been involved in it with you. And thank you to yourself for the work that you've done. And then you'll know that your feet are down and you're ready to move into the luminous future that you are deserving and that you are created for, and that work of reformation and creating that new life for yourself. Another thought that I had not too long ago was that I'm not settling for second best. My life's not second best. You know, remember that our goal is living happily ever after and making the fairy tale part of our reality. Going through that black box experience of character transformation and coming out on the other end, living happily ever after. And it's really only possible if we've done the work of recovery and had that transformation of our character. And we get to a place of realizing that our life is not going to be second best just because it wasn't what we had to start. In fact, our goal is to look back 10 years from now and say, oh my goodness, I could never have predicted how amazing my life was going to be back when I was so sad about whatever it is that I lost. And that's the goal that I would like you to have for yourself. So that'll do it today for recovery. Our next part in the series is going to be reformation. But before we do that, at 2 o'clock Central today, I'm going to sit down with you here and we're going to tell a story. I'm going to tell you a story about one of the most miraculous and amazing real-life fairy tales in the world. And I know you're going to want to be a part of that. So until then, this is Susan Westbrook reminding you that the greatest leaps in life always begin in your heart. Keep yours open and healthy. And thanks for joining me today. And thanks for everybody with all the thumbs up and all the texts that are coming through. I really appreciate that. Thanks for your support. Blessings for your Sunday. Bye-bye.